It was not supposed to be their fight. 4 American destroyers built for the First World War, with thin hulls, worn engines, and torpedoes that sometimes refused to run straight, were never meant to challenge the Japanese Navy's best night-fighting forces. Yet on the night of 24 January 1942, that was exactly what they did. The war in the Pacific was only 7 weeks old. Japan had overrun the Philippines, Malaya, and most of the Dutch East Indies. Allied armies were falling back faster than planners believed possible. In Washington and London, the situation reports all sounded the same. Japan was advancing everywhere, and nothing seemed able to slow them. But on the eastern shore of Borneo, at a port named Balikpapan, the Japanese needed oil. Their Imperial Navy ran on fuel refined there, and without it, their carriers and battleships would stop moving. To secure that lifeline, they sent an invasion force escorted by modern destroyers and supported by aircraft. Against that, the United States could spare 4 old Clemson-class destroyers, each with 4 tall funnels, a narrow beam, and a reputation for being wet, noisy, and obsolete. Their names were USS John D, USS Pope, USS Parrott, and USS Paul Jones. None of them were new, none had modern radar, none had armor. They carried 8 torpedoes each, a few 4-inch guns, and sailors who had never fired those weapons in real naval combat. Their commander that night, Commander Paul H. Talbot, understood perfectly well that modern war had surpassed the 4-stack destroyers, but he also understood that no one else was coming. While the Americans steamed through darkness at high speed, the Japanese convoy was easing its way into Balikpapan Bay. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, later famous for his role at Leyte Gulf, had sent his cruisers away to refuel, leaving only his destroyers to screen the transport ships. To the Japanese, it did not matter. They believed the Americans had already retreated from Borneo and would not return. Their doctrine said darkness favored them. Their optics and night-fighting training had crushed destroyer forces in China. They expected the same here. If you think 4 outdated destroyers charging into an entire invasion convoy in the middle of the night sounds like suicide, hit that like button right now, because what happened next was the first time in the war that anything had gone right for the Americans. Shortly after 0200 hours, the Americans saw what looked like a city on fire. It was the Balikpapan oil refinery, burning from earlier Dutch demolition charges. The flames silhouetted ships at anchor. The 4-stack destroyers had found the invasion convoy. At this point, the American position was dire. Japanese aircraft ruled the sky. Japanese destroyers were faster, newer, and armed with the deadly Type 93 oxygen torpedo, known later as the Long Lance. By comparison, the American Mark 8 torpedoes were unstable and prone to running deep. The only advantage the Americans had was that the Japanese did not know they were there. Commander Talbot ordered his destroyers to slow, reduce smoke, and begin their attack run. Every sailor on those decks knew the odds. Their ships were meant for scouting and screening, not solo attack against a major convoy. But the enemy was unaware. The night was black, and the refinery fire illuminated targets like lanterns on a calm lake. At approximately 0230 hours, USS Parrott launched the first torpedoes of the battle. Moments later, USS Pope and USS John D followed. No star shells, no gunfire. Just the hiss of compressed air and the quiet splash of torpedo wakes disappearing into the darkness. The American 4-stacks were weaving between Japanese transports so closely that sailors could hear voices speaking Japanese across the water. On the transports, confusion exploded. Searchlights swept across the harbor. Engines roared to life. Japanese troops scrambled for their rifles, expecting Dutch saboteurs or aircraft, not American destroyers slicing directly through their invasion fleet. The Japanese screening destroyers had pushed too far out to sea, looking for submarines, and now had to race back at flank speed through narrow waters filled with friendly ships. At 0235 hours, the first American torpedo struck a Japanese transport. A column of water taller than a building leapt into the air, followed by fire on the deck. Seconds later, another torpedo exploded against a second transport. Ammunition detonated, sending debris raining across the harbor. In the space of 5 minutes, The obsolete destroyers had done what nothing else in the Pacific had managed since Pearl Harbor. They put Japanese ships on the bottom. The Japanese convoy erupted in total disarray. Captains tried to maneuver without colliding. Searchlights stabbed through oily smoke. Troops crowded the decks, screaming orders that no one could hear over the roar of engines and detonations. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese were being hit where they expected to be untouchable. By the time the first gray light touched the horizon over Balikpapan Bay, the situation had reversed in a way no Allied officer would have dared to predict. The Japanese army had landed troops, but their transports were burning, exploding, or grounded in shallow water. Boats were darting in every direction, some carrying soldiers toward the beach, others trying desperately to get clear of the chaos. The Americans, on the other hand, still had 4 destroyers intact and engines turning. It was the first real American naval success of the war, but it came with a fatal condition. The Japanese destroyer screen was now returning at high speed, and they were among the best in the world at night fighting. On board the Japanese destroyers, disbelief was turning into anger. The officers knew that the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained relentlessly for night action. Their lookouts could spot ships by silhouette and muzzle flash. Their torpedoes were faster and more powerful than anything the Americans had. They had every technological advantage. Yet in Balikpapan Bay that night, their convoy had been ravaged by ships they genuinely believed had been chased out of the region weeks earlier. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was not present, but his destroyer captains understood their duty. Their job was to hunt down the intruders and kill them. The Americans had not just attacked transports, they had embarrassed the Imperial Navy at its moment of triumph. That demanded a response. Commander Paul Talbot knew exactly what was coming. His ships were old. Their boilers were strained from running at high speed all night. Their torpedoes were nearly gone. Their 4-inch guns had limited range and small explosive charge. Against modern Japanese destroyers armed with the deadly Type 93 oxygen torpedo, the Americans would not survive a gunnery duel at daylight. So Talbot did the only thing he could do. He ordered his ships to turn south and run at flank speed. The Japanese knew the waters better than the Americans. They had aircraft overhead and destroyers behind. The Americans had no air support at all. The sea was flat and the sky was brightening, which meant that every ricochet of sunlight off steel funnels made their position clearer and clearer. It was a chase now, and the outcome seemed preordained. Back in the convoy, Japanese sailors were boarding lifeboats, shouting orders, and attempting to organize firefighting efforts. The transports Tatsukami Maru, Nanamaru, and Sumanura Maru were sinking or ablaze. Ammunition continued to detonate, sending shockwaves across the harbor. It was the first time since Pearl Harbor that American naval forces had inflicted significant damage on the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the price for that achievement had not yet been paid. Shortly after 0700 hours, a Japanese reconnaissance float plane spotted the fleeing American column. From the aircraft's altitude, the 4-stackers were impossible to miss, long white wakes cutting straight south across deep blue water. The pilot radioed the contact report. Japanese destroyers accelerated. The chase had truly begun. Commander Talbot knew the Japanese would use aircraft to shadow him. His only hope was speed and smoke. He ordered full power to the engines. 4 funnels belched thick black smoke that stained the morning sky. The Clemson-class destroyers were built for 35 knots, but their machinery was 20 years old. Superheated steam hissed through worn valves. Engineering crews worked with tools and rags, sweating in the boiler rooms as they coaxed every last knot from aging turbines. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese destroyers, preparations were underway for a torpedo attack. Imperial doctrine emphasized decisive night engagements. Their torpedoes could run 40,000 yards and carried a warhead capable of breaking a cruiser in half. Against thinly skinned American 4-stackers, one hit would be total destruction. But the Japanese had a problem no manual addressed. They were chasing through tight waters filled with friendly ships, oil slicks, and wreckage. Firing torpedoes risked hitting their own transports. Instead, their captains pushed for gunnery range, determined to close the distance and use their heavier 5-inch guns to finish the intruders. For the Americans, Time was running out. By 0800 hours, Talbot's column had cleared Balikpapan Bay and entered Makassar Strait. It was open water, but that meant no more smoke from burning refineries to hide behind. The Japanese were closing, guided by the floatplane above. Talbot made a decision that went against every instinct of a man being chased. He ordered his destroyers to zigzag instead of running straight. He understood that a straight course made them perfect gunnery targets. A weaving course might buy minutes, and minutes meant distance. Distance meant survival. By 0900 hours, the Japanese destroyers were close enough that smoke from their funnel tops was visible on the horizon. The chase was becoming a gun duel. The oldest American destroyers in the Pacific were about to trade fire with the best night fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and there was no guarantee any of them would make it home. Meanwhile, Commander Talbot ordered another attack run. The four-stack destroyers accelerated, threw hard turns, and came back through the convoy like wolves circling panicked deer. More torpedoes left their tubes. More explosions lit the night. By dawn, multiple transports were sunk, others were grounded or abandoned, and the Japanese convoy had been mauled by ships it believed no longer existed. The part no one knew yet was that the Japanese destroyers were now closing fast, and they were furious. The most dangerous part of the battle was still ahead. Shortly after 0900 hours, smoke columns finally appeared on the southern horizon. At first, they looked like clouds that refused to move, but as the minutes passed, they sharpened into the unmistakable lines of destroyers running hard. The Imperial Japanese Navy had arrived. For the Americans, it meant only one thing. The four-stackers would now have to fight their way out of the strait or die inside it. Commander Talbot understood exactly what was coming. The Japanese destroyers were faster, newer, and had heavier guns. They could fire high-explosive shells farther than the Americans, and their fire control systems were designed for night action. Against that, the American ships had only speed, maneuver, and the psychological chaos they had already inflicted. Talbot knew that if his column scattered, the Japanese would pick them off one by one. So he held them together, line ahead, like antique cavalry outrunning a modern army. By 0915 hours, the nearest Japanese destroyer opened fire. At first, the shells fell short, geysers of white water erupting behind the American sterns. Then, the splashes crept closer. Every sailor on those decks could hear the high-pitched scream of incoming shells as they ricocheted across the sky. There was no armor to hide behind. The four-stackers were built in an era when speed was considered protection. But age had stolen their speed, and now they were exposed, with nothing but thin steel between them and high-explosive shrapnel. Aboard the Japanese ships, the mood was cold and methodical. Japanese officers believed that if they pressed hard, they would sink at least one fleeing American before it reached safety. To them, it was not revenge, it was duty. The convoy had been struck, the Empire had been embarrassed, and the intruders had to be punished. Each time the Americans zigzagged, the Japanese adjusted their spotting shots, closing range yard by yard. At 0930 hours, USS Pope returned fire. Her 4-inch guns could not reach as far as the Japanese, but Pope's shells arced high and fell near the leading Japanese destroyer. It did not hit, but it forced the Japanese to check their advance for a moment, breaking their perfect pursuit line. That small hesitation bought precious distance. In a running gunfight, distance was life. Talbot used it. He ordered smoke again, thick, black clouds pouring from the funnels. The Clemson-class destroyers weaved through their own haze, disappearing and reappearing in broken glimpses. To the Japanese gunners, it was infuriating. They had been trained to kill cruisers in open water at night. Now they were chasing old destroyers through a homemade smoke curtain that turned gunnery into guesswork. For nearly an hour, the running fight continued south through Makassar Strait. Shells rained around the Americans, some close enough to pepper their hulls with fragments. But none struck directly. Several Japanese ships attempted to flank to starboard, hoping to cut off the Americans from the south. But the Imperial Navy had a geographic problem. Makassar Strait narrowed into Allied-controlled waters, and Japanese destroyers were low on fuel after days of escorting convoys. They could not afford a high-speed chase that dragged them deep into enemy-held sea lanes. By 10:45 hours, the Japanese fire slackened. The shells fell farther astern. The trailing Japanese destroyers were forced to reduce speed to avoid running low on fuel. One by one, their gun crews secured their weapons. They had run out of time and distance to finish the hunt. It was over. The four stackers had escaped. They did not linger to celebrate. Their officers and crews were exhausted and dehydrated, and their boilers were near failure, but they were intact. They had sailed into a Japanese invasion convoy at night, torpedoed transports at point-blank range, outmaneuvered superior destroyers at dawn, survived aerial shadowing, and escaped into the southern strait without a single ship sunk. From the Japanese perspective, the outcome was humiliating. Their destroyers had failed to protect a convoy. Their night-fighting reputation had been challenged. They had allowed old foreign vessels to penetrate their screen and inflict real losses. Nobody in the Imperial Navy had expected to be beaten by 4 American ships built before the Great Depression. From the American perspective, the outcome was transformative. In a war where headlines had been one disaster after another, this was the first glimmer of proof that Japanese forces could be surprised, damaged, and outmaneuvered. The Battle of Balikpapan became the first American naval surface victory of the Pacific War. It proved that the Imperial Navy was not invincible, and that courage and aggression could offset inferior weapons and outdated hulls. The 4 Clemson-class destroyers continued to fight throughout the early months of 1942. USS John D fought in the Java Sea campaign and later in the Atlantic. USS Pope fought at Java Sea and was eventually sunk after a heroic running battle. USS Parrott served until 1943, when age and strain retired her. USS Paul Jones was withdrawn from combat and survived the war as a training ship. None of them were preserved as museum ships. Their thin hulls were scrapped, their 4 funnels cut apart, and their machinery discarded. But their legacy lived on long after they were gone. At Balikpapan, they proved that even outdated tools in determined hands could shape history. They were not designed to win major battles, yet for a few hours on a dark January night, they stopped a conquest long enough for the world to notice. In a war filled with massive fleets and aircraft carriers, it is easy to forget the moments when the smallest ships carried the biggest burdens. The last stand of the 4 stacked destroyers was not a single explosion or a desperate sinking. It was a decision. 4 old ships seeing impossible odds and charging anyway. If this story showed you how courage and aggression can defy the odds, hit that like button right now. For more true stories of impossible victories and the men and ships who made them happen, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. Could 4 destroyers today do what they did in 1942? Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.